Hello and welcome to this screencast presentation for the module Development and Sustainability. I'm Anna Hawkins and today I'm talking about urban ecosystems in terms of the connection between health and place. In this session I'm going to be talking about sustainability and resilience as concepts as they relate to cities, urban ecosystems as a concept, and how a city's ecosystem can affect the health of the urban population, and that's both the human and the non-human urban population. So you'll be familiar with these diagrams, I'm sure. I'll just move myself out of the way there. So we have on the right-hand side of the screen the kind of traditional Venn diagram for sustainable development, which is the three circles of the economy, society, and the environment as they overlap. And in the middle there's the idea of sustainability. And this diagram has now evolved really to recognize the relative hierarchies of those three elements, so that rather than seeing them as kind of equally important and most importantly independent entities, they're now recognized as part of a nested diagram, which is the diagram on the left of the screen. So the economy sits within society and society sits within the earth systems. And what this is supposed to do is really kind of refocus our attention on the fact that the diagram to the right suggests that you can have an economy separate from the environment and society. And actually, without the environment, without a biosphere that sustains life, none of those other two things matter at all. So in addition to the term sustainable development and sustainability, today we're also talking about the concept of resilience. And this term has started to gain quite a lot of traction, certainly through the COVID epidemic, because there's lots of talk about the resilience of systems, of people, of economies, and the environment to withstand shocks and interruptions. So the concept of resilience, as it says here, is about the capacity of everything from an ecosystem to an individual or an organization to bounce back, to deal with interruptions. So rather than the kind of sense of sustainability, which is this kind of static maintenance of a situation throughout time, resilience recognizes that actually there are going to be things that disrupt and interrupt and get in the way of the kind of smooth passage of human existence on the planet. And what we're actually interested in now is not pretending that those interruptions won't happen, but dealing with them when they do, and designing systems and having more flexible ways of living that can actually withstand those shocks and recover from them quite quickly. So when we're thinking about the concept of resilience as it applies to cities, we're really thinking about the way that a city is preparing itself for its vulnerabilities and recognizing its vulnerabilities and mitigating against them where it can, and dealing with them and kind of responding to them where it needs to. So the term resilience here, we have a picture of the New York subway during the last big flooding of the city. So the reason that we kind of talk about resilience in the urban capacity is that 75% of the world's population is projected to live in cities or in their surrounding areas by 2050. So we are an urbanizing species. So the way that we live in cities is really the most important way that we need to think about the way that we live as humans on the planet. It's also recognized that this process of urbanization has fundamentally changed the way that we understand ourselves in relation to the natural environment, and cause a disconnect between those two things. So urban populations used to sort of be seen as escaping from the limitations of nature and mastering it. And increasingly now we're starting to realize that that isn't the case. We've actually created more problems by moving away from that connection with natural systems. And that in order to have a resilient city, we actually need to bring these elements together again. We need to move away from the idea that we have urban and rural, and maybe start to think about developing cities that mimic some of the best patterns that nature has to offer in terms of surviving shocks to the system. And that vulnerability is really important, because the thing with cities is that although they seem all powerful, actually they don't produce most of the day-to-day things that people in cities need. So they don't grow a huge amount of food. They're not great at energy production. They don't produce fibres. They, not a great source of clean water. So a city has a huge infrastructure that it relies upon outside of its urban area. And again, that this connection is really kind of emphasizing that we've forgotten that cities are actually very vulnerable, but cut off from their supply chain, cut off from those global supply chains and global systems such as weather systems, then cities are actually incredibly vulnerable. They can't survive on their own. When we're thinking about urban sustainability, then we're starting to think about these interconnected systems, network thinking, circular systems, that actually understanding that cities don't function that differently from other living organisms. And most of the kind of contemporary thinking around making cities sustainable is actually starting to borrow not only the language from ecology, from natural biology, but also some of the processes from nature as well. So cities, as well as performing like an organism, actually we're starting to think about how we can reintroduce natural systems into cities in order to make them more resilient to change and also better places to live in terms of the health and well-being of the urban population. And diversifying that urban population so that it's not so dominated by people, and that it actually welcomes more biodiversity into the city in terms of different kinds of flora and fauna. So the concept of the urban ecosystem then is the connectivity of all the different elements of life within the city. So we're thinking about things like habitats for human and non-human organisms, changing urban environmental conditions in terms of things like heat island effect, increased rainfall, and the natural and people-made flows of energy, water, and materials. So cities are, energy comes in. We require a lot of energy to function as a city, but we also have obviously things like rainfall. We generate an awful lot of waste in terms of things like wastewater, pollutants, air pollution, that kind of thing. The urban ecology therefore considers the urban area as a habitat for all life forms, including people. And this is a really interesting and important development in the way that we think about cities, because there's a recognition that in order to make cities healthier places, then they need to be healthier not only for human life, but also for other forms of life as well. And it's only by readdressing some of those imbalances that we've developed in cities over the time by removing things like green infrastructure and clean waterways, that we can actually start to restore this quite holistic sense of health. So the kinds of things that make up the urban ecosystem, then we've got the built system, we've got the water system, the urban biosphere, the hydrosphere, the movement patterns of people, the land upon which the city is built, the material flows that come in terms of things like food and building materials and chemicals and everything else that comes in, what happens to those elements within the city, and the waste that is generated both through industrial processes, through transport in terms of pollution, through humans in terms of different kinds of human waste, and water systems. A good example of this kind of holistic cyclical thinking in the way that it starts to intersect with environment and health could be discussed through the example of the commuter. So if we think about the ways in which commuting can, taking different approaches to commuting can have quite large knock-on effects in terms of the health of the urban ecosystem, including the human being who's doing the commuting. So if a commuter decides to commute by car, assuming that that's not a clean energy car, then there is all sorts of pollution that's created by that. There's runoff from the roads, there's air pollution. The runoff from the roads and goes into the water systems. The air pollution is breathed in by people, it's absorbed by plant life, it's absorbed by animal life in the city, creating a huge number of problems. Health problems for the individual, they're also not getting the exercise that they would if they chose an active form of travel. Health problems from the emissions and unclean air. And also these health problems are being experienced by the wider urban population as well, outside of the human population. If that commuter travels by bike, then that not only benefits that individual in terms of their health directly through the exercise, indirectly through contributing to cleaner air in the city, but also it encourages different forms of urban layout. So encouraging active travel tends to mean increasing the amount of green infrastructure, minimizing the amount of paved space for cars, reducing the air pollution from vehicular travel, therefore benefits the wider ecosystem as well in terms of the plant life, the water systems, the marine life, and other forms of animal life. The connection between health and cities is becoming very holistic and very integrated, but it's really important to recognize that this connection has been long established in terms of an understanding between the different health outcomes for people living in cities, depending upon where they lived and the impact that different kinds of environments had upon people's health. So here's an example of a historic map from 1898. It's the Charles Booth's deprivation map of London. And what Booth did was to send a team of cartographers out, profiling the population of London and working out that actually there was a lot of inequality in terms of the location of people from sort of different levels of deprivation, and that you had clusters of extreme poverty and clusters of extreme wealth, and that the areas in which those people lived were often characterized things were having a negative or a more positive impact upon the health of individuals. So the connection between sort of the spatial layout of cities and health inequalities goes back a very long way. And this kind of map profiling of health inequalities is very familiar in the contemporary context as well. So here's a map of Sheffield, different levels of deprivation and health and life expectancy. Sorry, this is from 2015. So you can see here that the areas in red are the lowest life expectancy, through to the areas in blue, which are the highest areas of life expectancy. And this deprivation map shows, in the case of Sheffield, just how geographically divided the city is. And if you were to look at those different environments in terms of things like their green infrastructure, their proximity to industrial areas historically and contemporary industrial areas, you'd see that there are actually some very big differences in the environments in which those people live as well. So we're starting to focus in a little bit more now on health issues as they relate to the city. One of the first things that's important to discuss is, although that we are focusing probably more in this module on the environmental conditions that determine health, that the module focus of development and sustainability recognises the kind of social inequality dimension that underpins most of those other kind of environmental dimensions as well. And when it comes to health and differential impacts of health, then we see that there are huge social determinants of health. Often there's a strong correlation between different environmental conditions, but the social conditions and the economic conditions are the major determinants in terms of people's health outcomes. So the kinds of things that included in this, and you'll see that there are lots of similarities between these sorts of things and the things that you see in the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can map these kind of common issues that arise. So this is very much focusing upon urban populations. This is a study from the United States, but a lot of these characteristics are also used in the UK. So the social determinants of health are things like economic stability, so whether people have access to decent employment and stable incomes and can afford to pay their bills. And in this case, it's an American study, their medical bills, although it might be coming here soon if I'm not careful. The impact of the physical environment, so quality of housing, the quality of the transport infrastructure, availability of good quality green spaces, safe areas, areas that are walkable, education levels, access to decent quality food, well-functioning social infrastructure, so good community infrastructure, the people who are connected to their local area, have friends, have contacts, people that they can call upon if they need them, and then the healthcare system itself, so something there to provide healthcare and support. These things work together, and you can see how there's an intersection there between if you think back to that map of Sheffield from a previous slide with the deprivation indices. Let's go back to that. There will be a lot of those indicators that map onto this. So you'll see that income levels will reflect the same kinds of inequalities. So you'll have much lower incomes in the areas where you've got a lower life expectancy, much higher incomes in the area with a higher life expectancy, higher levels of education in areas with a higher life expectancy, and so it goes on. So those social determinants of health, if you were to do a similar map looking at levels of literacy, levels of education, wage levels, you'd see the same map recurring. So health is linked to all of those other social determinants. So to bring this back to cities then, and thinking about the element of the natural environment and the built environment and how that impacts upon health and the connection between the urban ecosystem and the health of the population of the city, we can again see that there is increasing research interest in thinking about how we can look at natural systems, so what's considered to be natural areas, rural areas, and then we can start to actually overlay some of those systems on the cities. So create urban habitats that more closely mimic some of the natural systems. So greening cities, having more natural ways of dealing with water systems, encouraging habitats for biodiversity, so welcoming different kinds of animal and plant life back into the city. Using natural cycling methods for things like water systems, air pollution systems, introducing more clean energy systems into cities, and actually starting to kind of move away from these kind of functions of cities that have imposed upon the landscape, and starting to look at blending the urban and the rural. And there are some very tangible examples of this kind of thinking happening now in policy terms in the UK. So this is a poster from Public Health England, which is recognising the interconnectedness of many of these elements. So if we want to try and promote something called active travel, which is basically walking and cycling and skating and anything else that actually involves moving the body to get you from one place to another, then doing that increases the sort of health and well-being of the individual, but it also addresses air pollution issues and creates different kinds of places really that are better suited to active travel. So footpaths and cycleways, improving green spaces, having less of the kind of tarmacked areas for roads, and all of the knock-on benefits of that. So air quality has been a really interesting development in terms of the way that the public has started to recognise air quality as an issue, particularly through the COVID pandemic. It's really drawn attention to the fact that people's health outcomes from the virus there's a correlation between areas of high air pollution levels and high respiratory illness, underlying respiratory illness, and the ways in which a population has responded to the COVID pandemic. So we're starting to understand the severity of the impact of air pollution on human health. Previously, air pollution has kind of been discussed as an environmental issue, something that we wanted to tackle because it was kind of a poor environmental issue. But increasingly, this has now been linked to direct health issues with the human population and the non-human population. So this is becoming far more prominent in terms of the public's understanding. There are obviously clear ways of addressing this. In terms of how do you tackle air pollution, we know how to tackle air pollution. You essentially address transport and industry, so transport practices and industrial practices within urban areas to improve air quality. And so there's a really clear road, if you can excuse the pun, out of the problem with air quality. But the problem with that is that there's an ideological issue, because in order to address those things, there needs to be some very strong legislative action. So actually we need to be banning certain kinds of behaviours, certain kinds of practices that are heavy pollutants. And what people see immediately, so we're getting a lot of backlash against the improved cycle infrastructure that's coming as part of cities' responses to COVID, because that impacts upon drivers' freedom to drive around the city. So something's got to give. You can't actually make improvements to the current situation without there being a change that some people perceive as negative and some people will perceive as an attack on their freedoms. So the ideological battle is there to be fought, and hopefully we can find a way forward um, that we can reach some consensus on. Another area that connects cities and the idea of health is thinking about food networks. So in my previous talk a few weeks ago, I was talking about consumption as an environmental issue and as a health issue. Cities are net importers of food. We don't produce very much food within our cities, but we need to think increasingly about improving the health of our food networks. Sorry, not only in terms of the range of food that are offered within cities, but also the kind of connections between the peri-urban, so the edge of the city, productive areas, and the local growing economy. So what food is produced within a reasonably local area, and how can we improve the sort of selling, the distribution and selling connections so that we can bring local foods into cities. But also, how can we make better use of some of the green spaces within cities as food production areas? And that's not only in terms of providing food, but also the activities that are connected with food provision. So, community cohesion around community growing projects, the physical exercise involved in gardening, repairing some of those disconnects between the functioning of cities and the supply chains that keep us alive. So raising people's awareness about the processes of agricultural practices, and all these things are kind of benefits of urban agriculture, but also making sure that we have good access to affordable and nutritious food for all of the populations within cities, and that's quite a challenge. So some of the ways in which health, human health in the way that we've traditionally understood it, and environmental benefits in the way that we've studied them as well, intersect are around things like green space. So green spaces, we've already recognised the environmental benefits of green infrastructure and green spaces. So they're good for biodiversity, they're good for filtering water systems, managing rainfall, flood risk in sustainable ways, and filtering pollutants and lots of other things. But we're now recognizing that they're also good for our physical and mental health as humans. So better green spaces are better for everyone. That the kind of industrial agriculture, the environmental degradation, and the changes within our food systems are actually, not only do they have huge negative environmental impacts, but they also are producing food that's making us quite sick. So, antibiotic resistance, high levels of processing, and things like that are starting to have negative impacts in terms of human health as well as the environment. Air quality now, as I mentioned, we're recognising that that's not only having a negative impact upon the physical environment within which we live, but it's actually directly impacting upon human health in quite catastrophic ways. And we're starting to realise just how bad that is and how urgent it is that we change. Things like transport policy. So you can think about transport policy in terms of sort of environmental functionality, but you can also think about it as a function of the healthcare system. So how can we have a transport system that encourages people to be active in the way that they move around the city rather than supporting more sedentary lifestyles? And finally, in terms of things like extreme weather events, we recognise them as an environmental issue. We also recognise them as having sort of impacts upon people's health, both in terms of direct harm, harm to human health directly, but also in terms of kind of the stresses and the anxieties of living within extreme weather events and the uncertainty around extreme weather events. If we access and engage with nature, then there are direct health benefits, both in terms of our physical health and our mental health. But it's also really important because it's part of this reconnection with natural systems. So if we spend more time in nature, not only do we have that short-term benefit, but we're likely to have a better empathy for, understanding of, relationship with the natural environment. It's more likely to make us want to engage with the natural environment as an important resource. And this is really important generally for us because moving forward, we have incredibly important targets that we need to meet for changing and improving our built environments so that they are more sustainable and more resilient, and that they support human health. And in so doing, recognize that you don't support human health by also supporting a complex type of urban ecosystem, both in terms of plant life and microbial life and animal life and human life within cities. So if we want to achieve all of these different kind of environmental targets, we need to have that kind of holistic sense of the way that we move forward as cities. And there's some of the key texts from today. I hope that's been helpful. Thanks. See you in class.